Thank you, Khalid. I mean, you could really have gone on and on. There's so much to be said about these decades. But I'll give the floor to our discussant, Dr. Bishai.
Thank you, Omar. Tell me, please, what time am I allowed? Because I tend to stick to what you will say.
15 minutes.
Okay, fine, thank you. Well, I am delighted and honored to be a discussant, actually, given that this talk was given by Dr. Ikram. The word discussant is not applicable, actually. So we are chatting about what a resourceful lecture you gave. We will want to chat about it. Let me just mention that 2 or 3 days ago, Foreign Affairs announced that Dr. Ikram's book was one of the best books of the year 2018. And this has just been communicated to AUC Printing Press, and this is the first time that it happens to AUC Press. So, well, I wouldn't say congratulations, but congratulations since a long time ago. I will talk in 2 different parts. The first part, sort of drawing your attention to some of the points Dr. Ikram mentioned. What Dr. Ikram said in 45 or 50 minutes really is a jewel. He told you the history. And effectively, he's saying the Egyptian economy from 1965 to 2018 has been floating but not swimming, if I may use my own words. And he said that injecting some interesting remarks as he was talking. So he said reform is urgent. And in analyzing that, he, as someone who worked nearly half a century on the Egyptian economy, and he's someone to whom everyone in this country and current policymakers should listen, actually. I dare say that. In a nutshell, the country has been following some form of conflicting objectives. The wonderful thing about this 3rd book Dr. Ikram is writing about the Egyptian economy is that he is now marrying economics with policy. And not just figures and figures and figures, and he is talking about policy and is showing that reform is urgent. And reform is urgent, you know, in saying that he looked at from the experience from 1952 and showed that we were all the time doing things, to summarize what you are saying, in an ad hoc manner, not in a continuous manner with a clear-cut vision. 1952 something, then comes 1956, all these wars, then the idea of, you know, you talked about the Romans, bread and circuses, you talked about Egypt, bread and the political thing, but also bread and football in the case of Egypt, if we want to make them comparable to the Egyptian situation, watching football matches. So instead of circuses in the case. So he said very deep, he said simple points, but it is based on very deep economic analysis. For example, when we keep saying we want to increase exports, then you find influential people and good people in government saying, yes, exports have risen, but regrettably imports are rising. Well, if exports are rising, imports must be rising for someone who knows economics, because there is always an import content to exports. And he even underlined this more than the way I teach it in my international economics, where he told you that the experience of Korea, he is a gentleman who worked 10 years in Korea, by the way. If you are all fascinated with Korea, one day you should have him lecture to you on Korea, Dr. Ikram. He said something very interesting. He said export drive in Korea is summed up in its import policy. So this is something on which I can give a lecture, and he can give a lecture better than me. So things are more complex than they appear. Then he spoke about 1st generation reforms and 2nd generation reforms, I will come to this later. But before I come to this, I want to quote something from the book of Dr. Ikram, which will make me make suggestions about the future. Dr. Ikram said something very interesting, which is something I always talk about Egypt, because everyone, since I was a boy, who talks to me about Egypt, he said, are you optimistic? I say, I'm always optimistic for two reasons, I say. Egyptian, I always believe in culture and history in making any economic or political projections. I say this is a resilient country, and I know something about Egyptian history. And I remember when I was a student at the American University in Cairo, Sir Arnold Toynbee, the world's most famous historian, when I was undergraduate, a few of us who were excelling, we met him and he said, where do you come from? I said, I come from Egypt. He said, Egypt. Egypt and Yemen, these are resilient civilizations. Now, in Dr. Ikram's book, there is the following. A few words I will read for you. He says, consider some reasons for optimism, full stop. In 1947, the country had a population of some 19 million inhabitants. In 2016, the population of Greater Cairo alone was about that number. The difference italicized, the difference between Egypt's present 2016 population of some 90 million and that in 1947 is equal to the total present-day population of the United Kingdom and France. These 90 million persons, 4.5 times the number in 1947, have on average, listen to this, these are facts, have on average higher real incomes, are better fed, housed, clothed, educated, and connected to the rest of the world, and have longer life expectations and much greater opportunities to fulfill their capabilities than their counterparts in 1947, etc., etc. Remember what I quoted. It's very serious what he said. Despite all that, despite that the way we were moving was such as to make us float, but not swim. We were underperforming. Despite all that, I quoted you word for word that somehow facts tell that things are not that bad. And here I want to grope into that. If things are not that bad, why is this so? Despite the fact that we had conflicting objectives and all that and so on. And this is fertile subject for research. And I would just want to mention a few things before I go to the end part of what you said. How come? It sounds like a contradiction. It is not a contradiction. What kept the pot boiling? Okay, I remember you said in many instances, people went, he quoting that writer, by perspiration instead of innovation, or we can say perspiration instead of inspiration. But I would even use the word inspiration, you know. The thing is, I have always been fascinated for tens of years by the informal sector of the Egyptian economy. The informal sector of the Egyptian economy, as far back as 1982, I said it may be like 70% or more of GDP. We didn't do what Italy did 36 years ago when an article was published in the Economist magazine, and they said our friends, the Italians, I'm very attached to Italy, by the way, revised overnight their GDP when they had a problem with the World Bank and so on, and ascribed a value to the informal sector and ended up with a per capita income higher than England. But we didn't do that anyway. But it was, I still have that article. So the informal sector in Egypt, about which people, De Soto, you remember, he came and you were with me and so on, and regrettably it was a bit tough in all the times he came. I demolished what he was saying when he said formalize the informal sector. I said here, look at what is in the الساحل الشمالي, you know, all these buildings. This is formal sector, but it is debt capital because he talked about debt capital. For me, the informal sector has always been dynamic. For me, the informal sector, talking about productivity, who has measured the productivity of the man who carries a slab of 1,000 loaves of bread on a bicycle, which doesn't have brakes, and he makes turnings, he breaks it with his legs? Has anyone measured his productivity, which is the second factor you remember you mentioned? No one has ever mentioned, looked at his productivity. Who would remember that in 2009, the BBC World Service in the news interrupted the news and said, we are now in the Great Recession. Ladies and gentlemen, there is one place in the world, although we have huge unemployment in Europe, in America, everywhere, there is one place in the world where there is full employment. That place is Damietta. I wrote a lot about Damietta, by the way. And Damietta has full employment. And again, Damietta is a situation where you have the informal sector married with small-scale enterprise to produce something unique, to produce economies of scale. Although you have small, 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 plus informal, yet you get economies of scale, which means cost reductions per unit. It is a unique situation that have been preaching all the time about Damietta. So these are some of the factors that Professor Ikram made that in lucid, super succinct English. He made this remark about somehow, despite all that, you have all these achievements, which I read for you words for word. So let us not ignore that in the informal sector there is creativity. Let us not ignore that in the informal sector some of the factors we teach for perfect competition, that knowing what to do at a time, and knowledge prevails. The man discovers that when you are driving in the ring road, car stops. So suddenly you find people selling Smoeda meat. And at 200 meters in advance, his son is selling water, because in the heat after you eat this meat, you need to drink water. This is the model of, you know, efficiency, in a way like competition. So I am just alluding to these aspects just to show you that there are these factors that which keep the pot boiling, to use Charles Dickens' expression. Is there any Arab country around us in the whole world where if you get a punctured tire, a boy who is age 12 or 13 will fix it in 9 to 11 minutes? In Egypt they do it. Am I right or not? Again, this is productivity.
Now with Pirelli tires.
Yeah, معلش, for your car, Omar, but not for many other cars, يا عمر, معلش. Your car حتى من زمان يعني, it doesn't matter. So, now to come to another aspect of the whole thing. Dr. Ikram talked about reform, and there is urgency for reform. I'm not painting a wonderful picture. I'm saying we are underperformed. But I gave an idea why, despite all that, people are better. As you mentioned, I've quoted your words. And what I like is you talked about first-generation reforms and second-generation reforms. I loved your combination of economics and politics, and either, you know, when at times when we were, you know, okay, the money we're spending in Africa, going to Iraq in the days of Noor Said to change the regime, and many other countries, Yemen war and all that. Okay, it consumed a lot. But despite all that, now in needing reforms, you married economics with politics. I think we further need, probably your fourth book, it will be on economics and not politics, public administration. Administration. Why am I saying that? I gave a lecture in 1982 in AUC York Memorial Hall, which was published. People liked it. And then I said, you may like it, but Egypt doesn't need me, doesn't need an economist. Egypt needs someone in public administration. Why I'm saying that? Because therein lie the problem. You talked about, for example, even the good things, judges, etc., judicial system, it needs reform. My wife Magda works about reform. There is a word you taught me instead of these things taking. What is alternative dispute resolution? You worked in it, and then there is a word you say where you end, you gain, I gain, not you win, I lose. What was the word that you used? Mediation. Mediation. So all of this was done, but it is not applied. Mediation, because in mediation we end up still friends, not you won, I lost. So on that score, we have been sleepy. Not only that, but where I need your help, among the many jobs you did, you were 14 years in the Planning Commission. The real problem in Egypt, when it comes to public administration, I never took a course in public administration, but there is a problem. Any individual minister can be doing a super job, but there is a problem. You need a structure whereby there is a big plan for the whole country. Not when I came become a minister, I say, my policy is this, to hell with my policy. Who is I? There is no I. What is the policy of the country? A structure wherein there can be someone like, for example, the prime minister and say 2 deputy prime ministers in charge of planning. And the planning will apply to everyone and every ministry. And it is then that the Minister of Agriculture will obey when they meet, and the plan is for 30 years. And then there would be a long-lived policy. Last year, the Minister of Irrigation said, thou shalt not grow more rice, reduce it by 400,000 acres. What does he know about rice production? And I spent 12 years in my life in FAO working on rice. Does he know that Egypt is the world, is the leader in 22 countries in the Near East for rice? It sets the price. It used to export more than 1 million tons. He says water. Does he know that we are members of IRI, International Rice Research Institute, which I visited? And in the last few years, we introduced a variety of rice which doesn't stay in the soil 182 days, but 140 days. So we took care about that. Okay, water, I care about water more than him. 22 years ago, I wrote an article saying we have 24 golf courses which consume the water of households of 84 million people. Say, kill these golf courses and then it will work. We have a system of privatization. We never understood what it is. Under privatization, it doesn't mean that the minister sits and says, okay, you can do that. Under privatization, the minister should say, this land is yours, the water under it is not yours. It doesn't belong to you. You want to build a golf course, as the literature puts it, thou shalt not build a golf course. We don't have water for golf courses. So things like that. And so now anyway, they are going to plant the rice again. And the Egyptian rice is the Japonic variety, the best rice in the world. And we are leaders in it. There is a secret I might tell you about. In 1961, when Syria, you mentioned, seceded from Egypt, Nasser phoned himself, the Minister of Agriculture, because he knew that the Syrians loved Egyptian rice. He told him, don't send a kilogram of Egyptian rice to Syria for the next 3 years. So, I mean, things are taken as ad hoc decisions in a rash fashion, and not studied properly, and disconnected policies. And for that reason, the whole structure of the administrative system must change. Not just having, say, I remember when I was in the upper house of the parliament from 1998 to 2004, they said there was an energy issue, the price of oil and so on. They said the higher authority on energy, the gentleman who was sitting, the Minister of Petroleum, said, yes, it was established in 1982, but until then it never met once. So the administrative structure has to be done in such a way that decisions are binding. And I think I will stop here. If there are some questions, I'll answer. And I'm sorry, طبعا. لا برضو, I took a little bit more, but it is thanks to our speaker where the Egyptian economy runs in his blood, really, and he knows so much about it. And we need to see more of you for the future.
Initially, we were supposed to start the session at 10 to 12. We started at 10:30. So should we say that we'll stay till 12:30? Yes. Okay. If you allow me, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about the period 52 till today without understanding the origin of the problems. I mean, even Khalid Ikram, maybe he was trying to avoid discussing a number of issues, but when you think that Egypt in 1952 was 50 million, was 20 million population, out of that, 10% of the population were foreign communities. So we're purely Mediterranean, we were very much exposed to the rest of the world. We had Italians, we had Greeks, we had all sorts of communities. And this, I think, this mosaic, this fabric was the real strength of Egypt. Nasser came with a very aggressive social agenda. I think he destroyed Egypt on account of misplaced social justice. He tried hard, but really failed big time. Politically, his ambitions were far beyond his means. I just want to quote one story that I heard from Councillor Mahmoud Fahmy. Councillor Mahmoud Fahmy is a very wise man. He's a very prominent lawyer. He was the deputy head of the State Council in Egypt. And when he was young in 1962, he was part of the State Council, and he was sent with the military campaign to Yemen. He was in charge of the administrative and financial affairs. According to Councillor Mahmoud Fahmy, what was spent in Yemen in 1962 economics, I mean, for the 2 years later, after that, is somewhere between 4 billion pounds and 10 billion pounds. If we take the lowest estimate, which is 4 billion pounds, this would mean at 1962 economics, $10 billion. At the time, Egypt had 4,200 villages. Imagine if every village in Egypt would have received in 1962 economics 2-point-something million. I mean, it would have been Switzerland. So these fatal mistakes are not taken into account. We just go through them, and it will be very difficult to understand the problems that we are living in today without really studying the past, criticizing it, and Nasser is still appreciated. I mean, he might have good sides, but at least his fatal mistakes were never exposed, were never discussed, and people still believe in him in a very wrong way. Sorry? Because what?
We're going to have questions, so I'm raising my hand politely to ask for the question. When we reach the question session.
Are you trying to cut me short? Anyway, and even the attempts later on. I mean, it was a decade plus of failure after failure. We paid a very high cost. Sadat came, hero of war and peace, but still, I mean, even when Dr. Khaysouni tried to remedy some of his former mistakes of the 60s, because he had this guilt, and you know him, and I, you knew him and I knew him. He had this guilt, and he tried to introduce the first removal of subsidies. It was in '79, I think, and he failed. And had we managed to pass these subsidy removals at that time, maybe it would have spared us a lot of agony, because for 30 years nothing has happened, and subsidies started accumulating. I mean, Mahathir Mohamad came to power in '81, and Hosni Mubarak came to power in '81. Look at where Mahathir Mohamad left Malaysia 23 or 24 years later. Although it was a very corrupt regime, his 2 kids are extremely corrupt, but yet he delivered something, and people forgive him for whatever he delivered, and he made up Malaysia. In our case, it was status quo. And 90, exactly, he has been re-elected. So, because he delivered something. I mean, I don't think this would apply in our case, and we are still living in this vicious circle, and you are not facing the facts, let alone what has happened to the Egyptian, to the nature of the Egyptian people. I mean, they have changed substantially. I mean, take every aspect. I mean, you're talking about, you're saying that they are much better off than 47. I think everything is relative. I mean, the average life expectancy then was much lower than it was 30 years later. So, but the quality of life and the potential that this country had was just wasted. Okay. Questions? Just one question? You want to say something, Abla? You talk too much.